Hello, and welcome once again to another installment of Brooklyn Law School's series on law in time of crisis. I am Michael Cahill. I'm the dean at Brooklyn Law School. If you have watched prior episodes, you know that I have frequently been in conversation with members of our faculty. This time, I am happy to be joined by one of our distinguished alumni, Deborah Riegel, a partner and member of the litigation department at Rosenberg and Estis, which is one of the top real estate firms in New York City, and not coincidentally is a firm that employs a lot of Brooklyn Law School alumni, having been founded by two of our graduates, Gary Rosenberg and Warren Estis. So we are happy to have Deborah here today to talk about real estate in New York in the post-pandemic world. Avid viewers, again, might note that we have had a similar conversation on this topic with David Reese in one of our very early episodes. So, Deb, a couple months in, what has the impact of the pandemic been on landlords and tenants? Where do we stand now?
So unfortunately, I think a couple of months in, we are still very much in flux on both sides. And I don't think there's any dispute this is affecting landlords and tenants in different ways. The problem, as you know, as we've worked through this crisis, is that the government officials, from the governor to the legislature to the city council, are working in crisis mode, and that's certainly understandable. But as David spoke about, real estate is a huge driver in New York City,
right?
And there has not yet been sort of a broad-based, comprehensive approach to the multitudes of issues that have arisen, from tenants' inability to pay rent, which trickles down to landlords' ability to meet their obligations. And so, unfortunately, it feels like we are not very much in a different place now than we were 2 months ago in terms of, some path toward a resolution of all of those issues.
What has the government tried to do, whether or not it's been effective? What are the steps that have been taken? There's been a Tenant Safe Harbor Act. What has
Right.
that involved, and has it entailed any progress, or has it not been that helpful?
So, look, I think the activity so far has been politically driven. There are certainly immediate needs that tenants have. We have a huge unemployment issue. There's no disputing that there are many tenants who are in need of relief. So the Tenant Safe Harbor Act was enacted to give some relief to tenants from eviction as a result of the pandemic. So what it provides is that a tenant who is financially impacted by the COVID pandemic cannot be evicted for failure to pay rent during the pandemic. Landlords can get money judgments, and presumably at some point landlords may have some ability to collect on those money judgments, but no one will be evicted for their inability to pay rent during this pandemic. The problem with that, well, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, it was a reaction to the pandemic without, I think, regard to what the state legislature did just last June with the changes to the rent laws.
Mm-hmm.
While owners didn't love the changes that Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act wrought last June, it provided judges tremendous discretion to prevent evictions. Some would say too much, but we have a human system, and judges, in some respects, should be entitled within bounds to exercise their discretion. And the HSTPA gave them that. It gave them the ability, for reasons that would include the effect of the pandemic, to delay evictions for up to a year. So it feels, certainly to the owners community, it feels like the Tenant Safe Harbor Act not only was duplicative in some respects, but puts the burden on the owners without any corresponding relief for owners. So a landlord who gets a money judgment, and lots of landlords traditionally get money judgments to go along with their judgments of possession, doesn't really act on it. Because if your tenant can't pay their rent, the odds are, unless you have a high net worth tenant in a very high rent apartment, there's not going to be assets for you to attach. Very few landlords are interested in garnishing wages, and going through those kinds of enforcement procedures. So while the Tenant Safe Harbor Act is not cancel rent as some of the tenant advocates would like, it is very close to the functional equivalent without any corresponding relief for landlords. And that's potentially going to be a problem for the city down the road.
Which tenants or are all tenants impacted by this law? It's meant to protect people against financial hardship, but is that true only for people at the lower end of the scale in an absolute way? Or if there's a relative loss of pay for someone who has high pay but also has high rents, is that something that falls within the law?
So as it's drafted, it does. And that, I think, is going... With new legislation, the devil is always in the details, and the courts will have to sort this out, just as the courts have had to sort out the impact of the HSTPA. And while I don't think this is something that ends up at the Court of Appeals, this is something judges are going to have to wrestle with. If you're renting, a $20,000 a month apartment and you choose to stay there, the odds are you have the means to go someplace else that's more reasonable and within your means during the COVID pandemic. But there is an argument that as drafted, that law covers any tenant who is impacted by the pandemic financially and can't pay their rent.
Of course, regulation in any market, whether real estate or otherwise, will impact the kind of transactions that take place within that market, sometimes in ways that are intended, sometimes in ways that are not. What are the practical effects of the legal regulation we've seen on the rental market and vacancy rates or other things? Have they had a distorting effect, or what has the impact been?
Well, that's a problem in this market because by definition, rents are suppressed. They're suppressed because of the pandemic. They're suppressed because there are higher vacancy rates because some people have left the city during the pandemic. And so you have a Hobson's choice here if you're an owner, which is if you give a tenant a rent that reflects the current market, and no tenant is going to rent an apartment that's above market right now, then you're stuck with that lower rent for the duration of that tenancy. So that when the market comes back, and I know we all believe New York City will come back just as it has from every other crisis, but when the market comes back, you're now going to have owners who are stuck with pandemic level pricing because they cannot revoke their preferences, likely having the effect of having owners hold units vacant because they won't. If you're looking at a 30% drop in rents right now, and some people are saying that's what they're looking at, you can't sustain that long term. So those effects are systemic, and again, it all comes back to the need for some comprehensive approach to this.
Are there major distinctions between residential tenancies, which we've primarily been talking about, and commercial vacancies with regard to these issues?
Ironically, right now, there is still a moratoria on any commercial proceedings. The latest executive order extends the moratoria on commercial non-payment proceedings through September 20th. And if you read the language of the executive order, it's very clear that it relates to non-payment proceedings for tenants who are COVID affected. Notwithstanding that the governor's order is one line and really not subject to any interpretation, the courts and the New York City Department of Investigation, which regulates marshals, have taken the position that it applies to all proceedings.
Another impact is not only direct regulation, but also tax liability. So what have the tax implications of the current situation been for property owners?
So there's been no tax relief for property owners, and that's exceedingly challenging right now. Property owners are paying taxes based on assessed valuations that were determined prior to the COVID pandemic. 2021 taxes are being paid on higher assessed valuations. Owners have to pay those higher taxes now when their income is dramatically decreased. The tax commission may start hearing those cases in the fall, but the city is not a surprise. The city is cash strapped. So how much the city is going to be able or willing to adjust taxes remains to be seen. And so absent legislation, owners not only are having to meet their obligations without income coming in, but they're having to meet their obligations based on numbers that bear no relationship to the current value of their property. Which is why I say this is not a landlord or tenant issue. This is a real systemic issue that has to be attacked globally. You know, the impact trickles down to the city too, because what happens when owners start defaulting on their properties because they can't pay their property taxes, and now the city has to start in rem foreclosure proceedings, which I don't think they've done in years. I mean, I interned for the Corporation Council while I was at Brooklyn Law School, and they were handling in rem foreclosures then. I'm not sure it lasted much out of the 90s, if at all. So it's a challenging problem.
If I could ask you to dust off your crystal ball for a moment, think about the post-pandemic world. Any sense of what New York City real estate is going to look like after this crisis is over? There's a trend of people to perhaps leave the city residentially. Employers may or may not want office space in the city. Do you think that's going to bounce back, or would you be worried about the long-term trend?
Look, I'm an optimist. I live in New York City. New Yorkers are New Yorkers. And if you're truly a New Yorker, you're staying here, you're working through it, and we'll come out the other side. And it's true. I mean, after 9/11, the discussion of, you know, the city being dead, Battery Park City was never going to come back. Nobody was ever going to live there again. Downtown was, you know, nobody was never lived downtown. The same happened after Hurricane Sandy. And so historically, you know, we've hit these points. And every time we hit one of these points, we say, oh my God, this is it. This is the worst that could happen. But New York comes back. I mean, nobody is leaving New York permanently. TikTok just took several 100,000 square feet of space. Facebook took, I think, something like 600,000 square feet of space. Companies are coming here because it's New York. Now, are they coming here now because it's a good time to come here and rents are a little lower? Sure. But at the end of this, nobody is meant to live or work like this. Nobody is going to, on a permanent basis, work from home, you know, and lose the collaborative nature of working in an office and the, you know, the mentoring piece of it and the training piece of it. So I think the city comes back and people come back to their offices slowly. And I think and I hope that by this time next year, this was probably a painful period that we have moved past, and things are, if not completely back to normal, inching back, and, you know, and I can be fighting with my friends about whether the Mets or the Yankees are going to be in the World Series.
It's the Yankees.
Uh-huh.
One final question. You noted that you've been working from home, as have a lot of us. Any observations about what it's been like to practice law under these circumstances, or any suggestions for our students? What have you found that changes to be like?
It is not the way I ever thought I would be working. I think I have found that necessity is the mother of invention. I have found that I can work from home better than I thought I could. I think a lot of us are being more productive than we thought we would be. That said, look, it's hard. I think mostly it's the people. As I said, I don't think any of us were meant to work like this. So, you know, I think particularly lawyers, we like to talk. We are inherently, I think, social beings, and particularly litigators are inherently social beings. And so even through the pandemic, when we weren't sure what our staffing needs were, you know, we had interns in the office because it was easy to give them the experience when, you know, they were working for credit, and I could mentor students that way. And I think if there are other alumni out there who perhaps in this time are not so eager to be hiring attorneys or hiring law students, that's a really good avenue to be able to give back to the school and give the students some experience at a time when they desperately need it, because the competition for jobs when this is over is going to be fierce.
Well, Deborah Riegel, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. Thanks to everyone for watching, and please be on the lookout for further episodes in our series on law in time of crisis.